It was a bitter January evening when emergency services were called to a quiet neighborhood in a sleepy Midwestern town. The report was vague, disturbing, "Something's not right. I heard crying." But it suddenly stopped. When officers arrived at the modest two-bedroom house tucked at the end of a cul-de-sac, no one could have imagined the horror waiting behind that front door. Inside, a young woman stood barefoot on the linoleum kitchen floor, her eyes hollow, her hands trembling. She didn't run. She didn't scream. She simply said, "He wouldn't stop crying." Moments later, officers opened the freezer. What they found would scar even the most seasoned investigators. The woman at 43 Elmwood Street. Mara Whitfield had always seemed like a quiet girl. The kind you'd see at the grocery store, eyes down, gently swaying her baby in the carrier as she waited in line. At 24, she was a single mother living in her late grandmother's home, a modest, weathered place with peeling paint and creaky floorboards. Her neighbors described her as polite, but distant. Always tired. Always alone. The baby, Jacob, was just 7 weeks old. A small, fragile bundle of new life. He rarely made appearances outside the home, and when he did, he was often tightly swaddled and silent. Some thought he was sleeping. Others weren't so sure. That night, the 911 call came from Mara's next-door neighbor, Mrs. Helen Abbott. She said she heard something unusual through the thin walls of their townhomes. A baby, crying. Then suddenly, silence. Like someone had turned off a switch. Mrs. Abbott had been hesitant to call, not wanting to overreact. But something about that abrupt silence unsettled her. The police knocked on Mara's door around 8:42 p.m. No one answered at first. Then, after a long pause, Mara opened the door with a blank stare. She wasn't crying. She wasn't panicked. She looked empty. The officers asked if everything was okay. She responded softly, "He's asleep now. He's cold. So cold." That's when they asked to come in. The house smelled of dust, sour milk, and something else, something metallic. The kitchen lights flickered as the officers made their way toward the back. That's when they noticed the freezer door was ajar. Inside, beneath frost and bags of frozen peas, was a small bundle wrapped in a baby blanket. A quiet descent. The shock swept through the town like a winter storm. Local news ran constant updates. People were outraged, horrified, demanding answers. Why would a mother do something so monstrous? Why didn't anyone see the signs? But as investigators dug deeper into Mara's life, a darker, more complex story began to unfold. Mara had grown up in that very same house. Her mother, Eloise Whitfield, had passed away when Mara was just 10 years old. An overdose, they said, though the specifics were never public. Her father vanished shortly after, leaving Mara to be raised by her grandmother, Agnes. Agnes was known around town for being stern, old-fashioned, and intensely private. She rarely allowed Mara to have visitors. Neighbors recalled hearing arguments, shouting matches that seemed to come from deep within the walls. When Mara turned 18, Agnes passed away in her sleep, and the house became hers. The inheritance wasn't much, just the home, a bit of savings, and a closet full of secrets. Mara never left town. She worked part-time at a local diner, lived quietly, and rarely dated. So when she appeared pregnant nearly 6 years later, no one even knew who the father was. The baby no one saw coming. Jacob was born on a rainy November morning. There was no one in the delivery room besides the nurse and the attending physician. No visitors came to meet him. No social media posts, no birth announcements. Just a name scribbled on the certificate and a mother who looked exhausted beyond her years. From the very beginning, Mara seemed overwhelmed. Nurses noted she struggled with breastfeeding. She cried often. She seemed distant when she held the baby, like she was somewhere else entirely. After being discharged, she returned to 43 Elmwood Street and never brought the child in for follow-ups or vaccinations. No pediatric records were filed. No family visits. Just silence. The freezer, investigators would later learn, had been moved into the kitchen only days before the incident. Previously, it had been locked away in the basement, filled with old meats and forgotten meals. But Mara cleaned it out. She scrubbed it. Made space. This wasn't a moment of madness. It was something else. The journal. During their search of the house, detectives found something tucked behind a loose floorboard beneath the baby's crib. A small, leather-bound journal. Inside were dozens of entries written in neat, almost childlike handwriting. Most were incoherent thoughts, riddled with paranoia and despair. But some were hauntingly lucid. He cries all night. I see her in him. My grandmother. Her cold hands. Her voice in my ear. She tells me I'm doing it wrong. That is already ruined. That I'm not enough. Every time he screams, it feels like she's screaming through him. I can't breathe when he cries. It's like she's inside him. He's safer when he's still. When it's quiet. That's what she always said. Quiet means safe. Mental health professionals who reviewed the journal suggested Mara may have been suffering from postpartum psychosis, a rare but severe mental illness that can emerge in the weeks after childbirth. Left untreated, it can cause delusions, paranoia, and in extreme cases, violent behavior. But the damage had already been done. Jacob's fate. Miraculously, Jacob was found alive inside the freezer. Though hypothermic and barely breathing, paramedics were able to stabilize him at the scene. He was rushed to a children's hospital where doctors worked tirelessly through the night to bring his tiny body back to life. And they succeeded. Against all odds, the infant survived. The news brought a strange mix of emotions: relief, joy, but also confusion. How had Mara not killed him? Was it a mistake? A desperate act followed by immediate regret? Or had she hoped he would live, in some twisted, frostbitten way? Mara never confessed. In fact, she barely spoke after her arrest. She was placed under psychiatric evaluation, her expression distant, her voice a whisper when she finally muttered, "She told me to do it." When asked who she was, Mara simply stared past the officer and said, "The one who lived in the mirror." The hospital room was dim, quiet except for the slow, rhythmic beeping of monitors. Tiny Jacob lay swaddled in warming blankets, his skin pale but no longer blue, his breathing shallow yet steady. Nurses moved silently around him, checking vitals, adjusting tubes, whispering encouragement as if their voices might somehow help coax him back from the edge. Word of the infant's survival spread fast. Reporters camped outside the hospital. Social media exploded with outrage, theories, prayers. But behind the fury and fascination, a deeper question hung in the air like fog. What drove Mara to do it? The house whispers. While Mara remained under evaluation at a secure psychiatric facility, detectives continued combing through the old house on Elmwood. What they found only deepened the mystery. The home itself was in disrepair, peeling wallpaper, mold growing in corners, rooms that looked untouched for years. But there was one space that drew particular attention: the attic. Cops found it sealed off with a rusty padlock, the door nearly hidden behind an old wardrobe. When they broke it open, the temperature seemed to drop. Dust filled the air in thick waves. Inside was a child's bedroom, clearly Mara's, untouched since the early 2000s. There were faded posters on the walls, dolls lined on the shelf, and a small bed neatly made under a cracked window. But what disturbed investigators wasn't the age of the room. It was the writing. Hundreds of sentences, scrawled in pencil across the walls, layered over each other in frantic loops. She watches when I sleep. Don't cry. Crying brings her. Stay cold. She hates warmth. Some phrases were written dozens of times, as if a young girl had tried to purge something from her mind. Others were etched with such force they'd carved into the plaster. One wall bore a single sentence, written over and over like a punishment. If I'm quiet, I won't disappear. The air in the room was heavy, and even seasoned officers said they felt something, like being watched. One detective, Officer Jensen, later admitted he refused to go back in. I don't believe in that stuff, he said. Ghosts, spirits. But I swear something was wrong in that room. I don't care what anyone says. Mara's silence, and the woman in the mirror. Psychiatrists tried repeatedly to speak with Mara. She mostly stayed curled up in her bed, knees to chest, staring at the far wall of her observation room. She barely ate, barely blinked. But one night, after nearly 2 weeks of silence, she whispered something to the nurse, changing her for. "She's still there, in the house." The nurse, startled, asked her to repeat. Mara didn't. She simply turned her head toward the reflective metal strip along the room's wall and stared at her own dim reflection. "She told me the freezer would keep him quiet forever." The whispering legacy of Agnes Whitfield. Investigators began piecing together what little was known of Mara's grandmother, Agnes. A former schoolteacher, Agnes had left public life after a suspension in the early 90s. Though records were thin, rumors pointed to strange disciplinary practices, locking students in closets, forcing silence, punishing even the slightest noise. Old neighbors remembered seeing Agnes walking Mara to school, always gripping her wrist, always whispering something low and stern in her ear. One former classmate remembered Mara showing up with bruises and flinching when people raised their voices. When Agnes died in her sleep, no obituary was published. No funeral was held. And yet, her influence lingered. Police found several home videos in the attic, grainy VHS tapes labeled with dates and phrases like corrective session and emotional control training. One tape was especially haunting. The tape. In the dim flicker of old analog footage, a young Mara, maybe 5 years old, sits cross-legged in the middle of a bare room. Her hands are on her knees, her eyes down. Across from her, just out of frame, a voice speaks. It's Agnes. Calm. Cold. "What happens when we cry, Mara? We invite the dark. And what does the dark do? It takes us away." Agnes's voice never rises. But her words are precise, rehearsed, like a ritual. "How do we stay safe, Mara? We stay quiet. We stay cold." Say it again. "We stay quiet. We stay cold." The tape ends there, the screen cutting to static. Trauma reborn. Doctors now had a clearer picture. Mara had been raised in silence, punished for emotions, trained to fear warmth and sound. Experts suggested that after Jacob was born, the cries of a newborn, constant, loud, unpredictable, triggered Mara's deeply buried trauma. It wasn't that she hated her child. She feared him. To Mara, his cries were not the sounds of a baby, but the sirens of the dark her grandmother warned her about. Each whimper, each wail, brought back memories of isolation, punishment, and the cold attic room where she was taught to vanish. And in a moment of unraveling reality, Mara believed the freezer, a symbol of cold, silence, safety, was the only place her son would be protected from her. Who was her? The figure in the mirror? Agnes? A delusion? A ghost? Or all three? The system that failed them both. As the investigation unfolded, public anger turned toward the social systems that had failed Mara and Jacob. How did no one know she was suffering? Why weren't there wellness checks after birth? Why wasn't the family history flagged? A nurse at the hospital where Jacob was born anonymously told reporters that Mara had seemed numb after delivery but showed no overt signs of instability. With limited staff and resources, many new mothers exhibiting signs of postpartum depression slipped through unnoticed, especially those without support systems. Mara's prenatal care had been minimal, her checkups sporadic. But nothing she said or did raised enough concern to prompt intervention. By the time anyone listened, she'd already locked her baby in a box of ice. Jacob's new life. Jacob remained in the hospital for nearly a month before being placed in temporary foster care. Remarkably, he showed no signs of long-term physical damage. Doctors described his recovery as a small miracle. As of now, his future remains uncertain. The state is pursuing permanent placement with a carefully vetted family. Several couples across the country offered to adopt him, moved by his survival and the media frenzy surrounding his story. But his past will always follow. Just like Mara's. Shadows behind the glass. The psychiatric facility was located on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by trees, far from the noise and light of town. It was the kind of place where time seemed to slow, where the world forgot people and people forgot themselves. Mara Whitfield had been in Unit 3 for just over a month. Doctors diagnosed her with postpartum psychosis, layered over deep-seated childhood trauma and possible schizophreniform symptoms. She spoke only in fragments, most often to herself. Her eyes avoided contact. Her hands stayed folded like a child waiting to be scolded. But every day, she stared at one thing with chilling focus: the stainless steel mirror on the wall above her bed. She would watch it for hours. Sometimes, she would whisper to it. Other times, she would cry in complete silence, her tears rolling down without sound, her face expressionless. And then, one evening, just before the ward lights dimmed, Mara finally spoke to her doctor. Not a whisper, not a mumble, a clear, trembling voice. "She's still in there." The woman in the mirror. When asked who she was, Mara slowly pointed toward the mirror. "She tells me what to do. She told me to make the house cold again. Said the baby had her in him. That she never really left." Dr. Haskins, her attending psychiatrist, gently pressed further. Mara's gaze didn't waver. "She used to come out of the mirror when I cried. Said I had to learn to be quiet or she'd take me away. After Grandma died, I thought I was free. But she came back, through Jacob." At first, it sounded like a textbook case of hallucinations manifesting through a trauma-based lens. But something about the way Mara described the entity, a woman with no eyes, just shadows, a voice that sounded like wind through broken glass, chilled even the staff trained to process the darkest corners of the human mind. What unsettled them more was that this figure in the mirror wasn't new. It had been part of Mara's life since she was 4 years old. Therapy uncovers a deeper horror. As part of her treatment, Mara was asked to draw her memories. Sometimes this form of therapy allows patients to externalize buried emotions through image and color. Mara's drawings, however, were black and white. Pencil only. Always the same figure. A woman in an old-fashioned dress with an elongated face, no visible eyes, hands that curved into long, reaching claws. In every picture, this figure stood behind Mara, looming. In one drawing, Jacob was cradled in the arms of the figure. His face was blank, frozen. In another, the woman stood inside the mirror, with Mara looking in, reaching toward her own reflection like a child begging for help. When Dr. Haskins asked if the woman ever left the mirror, Mara looked at him and said, "Only when she's angry." A chilling discovery. Back at the house on Elmwood Street, forensic teams were still conducting their deep analysis. Though the crime scene had been processed, detectives felt something had been missed, some detail hiding in plain sight. Detective Lila Mendez, who had been on the case since day one, returned to the house alone one evening. She wasn't superstitious, but something about this case had gotten under her skin. She couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just psychosis at work. It was something else. Something older. The attic, especially, weighed heavy in her thoughts. She hadn't spent much time there during the initial sweep. But that night, driven by instinct, or perhaps dread, she climbed the narrow staircase and pushed the door open. The same child's room greeted her. Dusty, frozen in time, walls scribbled with mantras of fear and silence. But now, with a stronger flashlight, she noticed something odd. Behind a tattered old tapestry hanging above the bed, there was a square indentation in the wall. A false panel. She pried it open. Inside was an old, leather-bound book. Handwritten. Yellowed pages. Smelling of rot and something chemical. It was a diary, Agnes Whitfield's diary. The true face of Agnes Whitfield. The entries began mundane. Notes about school, neighborhood gossip, dinner plans. But gradually, the tone shifted. Mara cries too much. I see her mother in her. Soft. Weak. Emotional. I won't make the same mistake twice. Silence is godliness. Cold is discipline. The spirit of obedience must be carved into bone. Then, the final entry. She appears in the mirror now. I didn't invite her. I think she followed me from childhood. She watches Mara now. Tests her. Maybe she'll listen to her better than she listened to me. Mendez read that last page twice, her breath caught in her chest. Had Agnes also seen the woman? Was it a shared psychosis, passed through trauma like a virus? Or was something truly haunting this family? Unexplainable phenomena. In the weeks following Mara's institutionalization, strange incidents were reported by the new cleanup crew hired to prep the Elmwood house for foreclosure. Tools went missing. Lights flickered even when the power was off. A worker claimed he heard a baby crying upstairs, though the house was empty. One even quit on the spot after walking past the attic and swearing he saw a woman standing in the mirror, watching him with no eyes. Word spread quickly. The job was abandoned. And the house at 43 Elmwood Street was quietly condemned. The question of inheritance. Meanwhile, a legal debate sparked in the background. Could Jacob inherit the property where his mother had nearly ended his life? A judge quickly ruled against it. The house, and its history, would not pass to him. But the past had already left its mark. Jacob's foster family, who chose to remain anonymous, reported that while he was generally a calm baby, he sometimes woke up in the middle of the night, pointing at mirrors and crying uncontrollably. They covered every mirror in the house. They kept the temperature warm at all times. They never let him sleep alone. A final session. The storm outside mirrored the one inside her mind. Chaotic, unrelenting, and dark. Mara sat stiffly across from Dr. Haskins in the softly lit therapy room. The windows trembled with wind. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. This was her 7th session. But something felt different this time. Her posture was straight. Her fingers weren't twitching. Her voice, when she spoke, was steady and clear. She wants me to bring him back. Dr. Haskins didn't interrupt. Not Jacob. The other one. Mara turned slightly, eyes grazing the edge of the metal mirror on the wall. Her reflection seemed off. Her body didn't move, but the reflection did. Just a twitch of the head, a jerk in the shoulder. Barely perceptible, but there was another baby before him, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't tell anyone. I lost it early. Or thought I did. But she told me he never left. The room went still. Haskins leaned in. Mara, what do you mean he never left? She looked him straight in the eye. He lives in the mirror now. And he's crying. She says I can't ignore him anymore. The forgotten child. Back at the police department, Detective Lila Mendez, still haunted by the Agnes diary entries and the disturbing imagery from Mara's past, began investigating Mara's medical history. What she uncovered confirmed Mara's claim. There had been an ER visit nearly 14 months before Jacob's birth. Mara had arrived in pain, bleeding. The report labeled it a suspected miscarriage, but she left the hospital against medical advice before the procedure was completed. There was no follow-up. No fetal tissue collected. No confirmation. The staff wrote her off as emotionally unstable. No one asked if she was alone. No one checked the attic. Lila's stomach turned as she connected the dots. Was there another body? Return to the attic. Armed with a new warrant, Mendez returned to the condemned house with a forensic team and a cadaver dog. It was late, well past midnight, but she didn't care. Something inside her burned like ice. The attic was just as it had been, eerily preserved in childhood decay. But this time, the dog reacted almost immediately, growling low and pacing near a pile of dusty boxes shoved against the far wall. Beneath those boxes was a loose floorboard. Under it, wrapped in layers of cloth and plastic, was something far worse than anyone imagined. Tiny bones. A baby skeleton, barely formed. The remains of a fetus. And next to it, carefully placed, was a small rattle. One of the dolls from the shelf sat beside the bundle, its porcelain face cracked straight down the middle. There was no name, no birth certificate. No one had even known this child existed. But Mara had. And so had she. The entity emerges. At the institution, Mara's condition spiraled. That night, after the remains were discovered, staff reported strange disturbances. A night nurse swore the temperature dropped to near freezing in Mara's room, even though the heater was running full blast. Mirrors fogged on their own. Security footage showed Mara standing still in front of her mirror for nearly 3 hours straight, her reflection moving independently, smiling when she did not. The footage was reviewed multiple times. Glitches, they said. Artifacts. But one frame stood out. For a single second, just as Mara stepped away, the reflection in the mirror remained behind, watching. It was taller, older. Its face was obscured in black, and where the eyes should have been were only two hollow voids. Mara's last words. 3 days later, during another stormy evening, Mara was found in her room, unresponsive. No physical harm. No drugs in her system. No signs of self-inflicted injury. But her eyes were wide open. Her mouth locked in a small, strange smile. Her pulse, weak. Her body, ice-cold. Doctors struggled to revive her, but her vitals had dipped to a dangerous low. They feared organ failure from hypothermia, but the room temperature was normal. Her blankets were warm. Then, as they were about to sedate her, she whispered, "She's holding him now. I don't have to." And then she closed her eyes. The final tape. Detective Mendez, now obsessed with the case, returned once more to the house, this time alone. There was one final tape she hadn't watched. It was unlabeled, tucked in the back of the box, darker than the others. She played it in her car, the screen flickering in black and white. At first, static. Then, Agnes. Sitting in a rocking chair in the attic, staring directly into the camera. "There are rules in this house," she said. "The cold keeps her quiet. The mirrors keep her fed. If you feed her enough silence, she'll leave you alone." The tape cut to Mara, maybe 6 or 7 years old, locked in a closet, hugging herself, whispering through sobs. "I'm quiet. I'm quiet. I'm quiet." And then Agnes again. But once you open that door, once you let her out, she'll find new voices to quiet. Mendez stopped the tape. Her breath clouded inside the car. The temperature had dropped. The windows fogged. From the rearview mirror, she thought she saw a shape behind her. But when she turned around, the backseat was empty. And what of Jacob? Jacob now lived under a different name, in a different state. His adoptive parents did everything right. Therapy, love, warmth. But even now, they admitted, he was different. He hated being touched with warm hands. He didn't cry. Not once. At 3 years old, he stared into mirrors for hours. And one night, he spoke his first full sentence. "The cold lady says I'm her favorite." Legacy in the ice. Years had passed. The Whitfield house was gone, raised by the city under the guise of structural unsoundness. But those who had worked the demolition whispered stories. Frozen pockets of air. Mirrors cracking on their own. Workers quitting mid-job with tears in their eyes, some swearing they'd seen a woman's face watching them from the attic window, long after the glass was gone. The legend spread, swallowed by forums and whispers online. But for those closest to the truth, the police, the doctors, the families, this was no urban myth. This was something that lingered. Something that waited. Jacob grows quiet. By the time Jacob turned 6, his new parents had grown deeply concerned. He was intelligent, far beyond his years, but emotionally distant. Unsettlingly so. He never cried. Never yelled. He spoke rarely, and when he did, it was in strange, quiet riddles. He'd stand in front of the hallway mirror for hours, silently mouthing words, as though someone were speaking to him from the other side. He drew pictures of a tall, faceless woman, just like his mother had. And then one day, he asked, "Why did the cold lady say you'll go away soon?" His mother froze. "What cold lady, Jacob?" He pointed to the mirror. "The one who lives inside there. She says you're too loud." The bloodline. Meanwhile, Dr. Haskins had retired early, his experience with Mara Whitfield forever altering his view of medicine and madness. But he never stopped researching. He combed through public records, old asylum files, even letters from long-forgotten relatives. What he discovered was chilling. The Whitfield women had a pattern. Every generation, dating back over a century, there was one daughter who descended into silence, into shadows, into ice. Each one reported a woman in the mirror. Each one ended in tragedy, suicides, disappearances, institutionalization, and in every case, there was a child, usually a boy, who survived. But who never seemed quite right. It wasn't genetics. It wasn't madness. It was a curse. Or maybe, worse, it was an inheritance. A visitor returns. Detective Mendez had tried to let it go. She'd left the force, moved across the country, changed her number, burned the diary pages she couldn't forget. But some stories follow you. And one October evening, nearly a decade after the case closed, she received a small, unmarked package on her doorstep. Inside, a child's drawing. Crude. Pencil on paper. No return address. It showed a mirror. On one side, a boy, crying. On the other, a tall woman, grinning. Her hands were pressed against the glass, as though trying to push through. At the bottom, written in childish scrawl, "She says you're next." The final freeze. Jacob was 8 when it happened. A freak winter storm hit his town. Temperatures dropped so fast the air felt like knives. That night, power went out across several neighborhoods. Jacob's parents lit candles, huddled for warmth. But Jacob disappeared during the blackout. He was found in the garage freezer, standing upright inside, door open wide, humming softly to himself. He wasn't cold. He wasn't blue. His skin was warm. He smiled. She said I could be like her now. When asked who she was, he simply pointed to the steel handle of the freezer. Reflected in the chrome, very faintly, was a woman's silhouette. Epilogue: the woman in the mirror. To this day, no one knows who, or what, she truly was. A spirit? A fragment of trauma passed like DNA? A demon feeding on grief and silence? Or something older? Something that found a home in broken mothers and forgotten children? What is known is this. Every mirror holds a shadow. Every reflection has its own will. And sometimes, just sometimes, when the world goes cold and quiet, she still finds a way to whisper through the glass. Be still. Be silent. Be mine. So the next time you catch your reflection moving just a half second behind you, look a little closer. And pray she's not watching. If you were chilled by this story, don't forget to like, comment, and share. Tell us in the comments, have you ever seen something strange in the mirror? Something you couldn't explain? Until next time, keep the lights on. And never, ever turn